Resident Evil Zero is a bit of a weird game, to be honest. A weird game with a really interesting backstory. See, when Capcom was making the original Resident Evil back in 1996, they had the genius idea to make a prequel to the game, made for the Nintendo 64 and designed specifically around its limitations. A Nintendo 64 cartridge only had 64 megabytes of storage, which is tiny in comparison to the 660 megabytes that could be utilized with a CD-ROM. But even with that limitation, they kept developing the game for the N64 until late 2000. And taking a look at some of the footage for Zero back when it was on the N64 is a really interesting watch. It certainly looks like an RE game back from that time period. Things like the reused zombie models from RE2, the dainty sounding gunshots from Rebecca's gun, and the general mood and atmosphere make me feel weirdly nostalgic for these older generations of RE games. In a weird way, I guess, this generation of RE gives me a cozy feeling. But I think the biggest takeaway from this footage is just how similar it looks to the game that we actually got. Well, at least in terms of general design anyway. Visually speaking, it looks more brown? The two versions share layouts, events, and even cutscenes with each other, so it's safe to say that when they decided to move away from the N64, they definitely made sure a lot of their hard work didn't go to waste. It'd be really interesting to see how much of the game they actually managed to make beyond the opening train segment, because if they did make a lot of the game with the limitations of the N64 in mind, it might explain some of the weirder design choices that they decided to make. RE0 made its debut here in Europe when it released in 2003 as a GameCube exclusive during that time period where Capcom and Nintendo were best buddies and released almost all of their big titles on that system. But today we're playing the fancy remastered part of the game that came out in 2016, which allows the game to be enjoyed in full, crisp HD.
Wow!
But that's enough with this goddamn intro. Let's talk about this motherfucking video game. So, as I mentioned earlier, RE0 is a prequel to the original Resident Evil, and directly sets up the events that take place in that game. In RE1, the STARS Alpha team went to the Arklay Mountains in search of Bravo team, who went missing somewhere in that region, and as we progress through that game, we find out that, spoilers, most of that team are either already dead or die just as we meet them.
Don't come.
All except for Rebecca Chambers, that is, who was essentially just the sidekick in Chris's playthrough from that game, and honestly, let's be real here, no one's choosing Rebecca over Barry in that game. Overall, Rebecca was pretty forgettable in the first RE. Don't get me wrong, she's fine as a character, but she didn't really get to do all that much. So after playing through RE1, if you had told me that there was a prequel game that starred Rebecca as one of the main characters, I would have probably been like, yeah. Okay, cool, whatever. The entire idea behind Zero is kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, yeah, sure, it'd be nice to find out exactly what happened to Bravo team, and it could have been like an alien scenario where we could have got to know them really well before they started to get picked off one by one, but the story that we actually got is, well, it's a lot weirder than that. Rebecca isn't the only playable character in this game though, because we've also got the ultimate Chad himself, Billy Cohen. He's a grizzled soldier with a tribal tattoo that's done some pretty messed up stuff, and we aren't really sure whether or not we can trust him. But because we're in this crazy situation together, we're just gonna have to make this work. But in all seriousness, the setup here is kind of interesting. See, Bravo team is actually out looking for Billy because he's a convict. Billy was a soldier that recently got court-martialed from the army for killing a bunch of people. Bravo team comes across an army vehicle full of dead soldiers, and since they were transporting Billy, and his body isn't there anymore, they assume that he did it, which I mean is probably a pretty fair assumption to make. And it's at this point that Bravo team then comes across a stopped train in the middle of nowhere, and I'm gonna have to talk about the zombie slugs. Okay, so this train is actually en route to an Umbrella facility, and Umbrella are bad people, by the way. But before it can actually get there, we see a man looking down from this hill, and he starts singing to the slugs, and and then they all attack the train. Do we really need a prequel to RE1? Like, do we really need it? Anyway, these little zombie slug things are actually carriers for essentially the T-virus, and when they attacked the train, the virus spread, bada bing bada boom, we got zombies now. This is where the game really begins, and I have to say that I actually really like the train segment. It serves as a great tutorial for the game's mechanics, both as a refresher for people who haven't played an RE game like this in a while, and for people who are completely new to this kind of gameplay. The first room gets you acclimated to how it feels to move around and navigate the environment. But in the very next room, you suddenly have to deal with 3 zombies, which is way more than you had to deal with in the first room of RE1, and way less than RE2. And this scenario is something that I actually find pretty interesting design-wise. There isn't really much room to run past them without getting bit, so the game forces you to make a very quick decision. Just try to shoot them and get out of the situation easily, but run the risk of not really being prepared for other enemies on the train, or try to bait the single zombie here nearer to the center of the compartment so you can run around it, which also carries the risk of being attacked by these 2 over here. It may seem pretty simple, but this first area is a perfect microcosm for what the entire series is about. Split-second decision-making that can have a heavy impact on how easy or hard the game can get for you, depending on how you use the resources that are at your disposal. Alright, so I'm gonna summarize what happens next on the train. Just up ahead is where we actually get to meet Billy for the first time, and he's gone. Edward jumps through a window, he's dead. We kill a zombie dog, get snacked on, Billy's back, but not really. Zombie slug man appears, the worst enemy type in the game, we'll get back to that later. And then the coolest thing I've ever seen happens.
Oh my god!
Followed up by the weirdest fucking thing in this entire game. God, go away, please. And right here is where we finally get to the meat and potatoes of this game. Character switching. A cool idea that works out pretty well sometimes, and other times, not so well. The introductory puzzle for character switching is pretty good though. Progressing through the train will eventually lead to Rebecca getting stuck in the kitchen of the train. I guess Burger King was right. But in the kitchen is a service elevator to one of the previous rooms, which Billy can access the other side of. So you have to find something that can fit in this service elevator that can get Rebecca out. This means that we've got to backtrack through the train as Billy to find what we need. This is something that actually happens a couple times in the game. One character gets stuck in a room while the other has to go find a way to get them out or back on the path of progression. And most of the time, it's an interesting puzzle in itself and something that you don't really see in a lot of the older RE games, since you've never really had to worry about anyone other than yourself, so it makes for a nice change of pace. The item that you actually need to get Rebecca out in this case is an ice pick, which is the perfect size to unjam the lock for Rebecca, but you get stopped by a gigantic scorpion that comes out of nowhere. Seriously, where does this thing come from? I guess it was in a box or something and then it got like mutated? I didn't really pay much attention, I don't know. And if any of you are feeling pretty clever in the comments and you decide to go, oh duh, it came in from the ceiling, fuck you. Anyway, this fight is the start of a long trend of pretty shitty boss fights, but it gets a lot worse by the end than this thing. You go back to Rebecca, send the pick to her, she gets out, and after some more exploration, shit suddenly gets real. Umbrella soldiers appear to take back control of the train, and oh, they're dead. Jesus Christ. But hey look, it's Wesker and Birkin. So yeah, this game also sheds a bit of light on these two and their relationship with each other. I'm always down to have more Wesker content, and this game kind of delivers with that. He's in a handful of cutscenes before he fucks off to RE1, and yeah. That's cool, I guess. I will say, though, that Birkin looks so weird in these cutscenes. I can't explain why, but God, he just looks so weird. God, okay, where were we? Oh, right. Rebecca and Billy get to the engine room and realize that the train is speeding and can't be stopped from there. So Billy has to run back to the other end of the train to activate the emergency brake system, which is a math minigame. Oh no.
Son of a bitch.
They manage to stop the train, or, well, the tunnel stops the train at least, and now we enter what I would like to call the forgettable part of the game. And by that I mean the entire rest of the game. Now for me, the major problem with this game is a lack of originality. The train segment sets a pretty good precedent for how this game might proceed. The train is an interesting level that I feel like we haven't really seen from the series before. A linear environment that feels claustrophobic and, most importantly of all, streamlined. I mean, it's literally a train. You can't get more linear than that, which makes it perfect as a tutorial for this game. Unfortunately, the game doesn't really have any interesting environments after this point. I mean, think about it. If you've heard people talk about this game, do they ever mention any of the areas set after the train? Because that's definitely not something I see ever being mentioned. And this is a problem because the next area of the game, the training facility, feels almost identical to the mansion from Resident Evil 1. And I mean that in terms of both its structure and its aesthetics. Like, seriously, it has its doors in the main hall placed in almost identical spots, and the front door blocked by these statues, which you unlock later on, even feels reminiscent of the front door of the Spencer Mansion in some ways. Now, this isn't an issue in itself, because I'm all for callbacks like this, but I mean, come on, this just feels kind of weird. In story terms, the training facility was a boarding school used to teach and train students that would one day join Umbrella. So essentially, it's like a really, really, really messed up Hogwarts. Though, maybe they're like on the same level nowadays, I don't know. As such, you can explore lecture rooms, dorms, and other places you'd expect to find in a boarding school. Like, swimming pool? Alright then, fair enough. Maybe Wesker liked a dip. Most of these areas are pretty boring to explore though. Again, this part of the game just lacks a lot of personality. I feel like I'm just staring at rooms from RE Remake, and fair enough, it's using the same engine and a lot of the same techniques that game did, but I mean, come on, I want something a little more unique here. It doesn't help that the actual exploration puzzles aren't really that great either. Exploration plays out like this. The first new area you can explore here is the upper levels. You find a crank in the meeting room, which then lets you use this elevator to access the upper floors of the facility. From there, you do some more wandering and solve a little puzzle and eventually run into the next boss, which is a giant centipede. This boss grabs Rebecca, so you've got to keep shooting it as Billy to eventually get it to go away. It's not great and doesn't really do anything. It just kind of moves around and occasionally slaps you, 2 centipedes out of 10. From there, you do some more exploration, which eventually leads you down to the lower levels of the facilities, where you find a couple of torture rooms and some older looking stuff that indicates that Umbrella's been doing some shady stuff for a pretty long time now. But to get into this room, Billy has to give Rebecca a boost through a small gap in the wall, since the door is locked. So now, they're split up, and after a little puzzle involving a power generator, trust me, it's more fun than it sounds, Rebecca gets attacked by zombie monkeys and falls through the floor. Again, did we really need a prequel? Then, as Billy, you gotta race to go find where Rebecca has fallen to, and this bit is hilarious. There's no real indication of where to go, so you could be going down and completely miss the door that you actually need to go through on your first time, but I did kind of like these moments when they happened because they injected some much needed urgency into the game. You know, some moments that can really get the blood pumping. And on a genuine note, the OST in this game is actually really good. The music that plays when you've got to go and save Rebecca feels really urgent and fits the situation well. In fact, this is a good time to talk about the ambience of the game in general, because in terms of pure atmosphere, this game does a pretty good job with building that tension. The sounds that play when you're just in the facility remind me a lot of Silent Hill actually. The low droning sounds interrupted by the high-pitched noises every now and then create some great ambience. Really reminds me of the walk into Silent Hill from Silent Hill 2. Though, to be honest, this game is never, ever scary, or tense, to be honest. Even though the backing ambience is really good, it doesn't really do much as a whole here. I mean, RE isn't ever really supposed to be scary, I guess. It's B-movie cheese, and that's fine too. But for whatever reason, the way that this game uses that sort of horror is just kind of boring to me. In fact, that's a really good way to sum this game up in general. It's just kind of boring. Writing out the script for this video is actually really difficult because it's hard to think of genuinely interesting or good things that this game actually does. In fact, at this point, I don't even know if I really like it or not. There are things here that I really like the character switching, and I like some of the puzzles a lot. But let's start talking about some of the things that this game does not do very well at all. The pacing is terrible for one thing, and this is kind of a lot of problems at once, but right now I'm going to blame it on the way that the game handles inventory management. Alright, let's create a hypothetical situation. Let's say that you've been playing as Billy for a while and you've managed to get yourself in a situation with a tough enemy. You've blown through all of your ammo, and your health is in danger. In any other RE game, this is the point where you would figure out where the nearest save room was to you and start making a beeline for it. From there, you could access your stash, grab a few healing items, and stock up on some more ammo and head back out into exploration. This kind of system works very, very well, since you have all of your important items in one centralized container that you can access from many locations. But what it meant at its core was that you could just play the game without having to worry about where to put your items, because regardless of if you were Jill and had 8 inventory slots, or you were Chris and had 6, you still had a place to store your extra shit. Now, what does RE0 decide to do? Well, it just forgets about all that nonsense. This time around, there are no storage containers, and honestly, barely any save rooms at all. They just kind of throw typewriters wherever. I mean, look at this. There's one in this main hall, and then up the stairs and through these doors, there's another one right there. I mean, come on. So since there are no storage boxes, when your inventory is full, you'll either have to just leave the item there, or drop one of your other items for it and come back to that item later on. And if you can't already see why this is an awful idea for pacing, let me explain it to you. Let's say again that I have the grenade launcher, but don't really want to use it right now, so I decide to keep it in a corner and keep all of the ammo right next to it. But then I progress through the game some more and accidentally leave it behind in the first area. In order to go get that grenade launcher, I would need to backtrack all that way, deal with any enemies I encounter, which would potentially cost me ammo and health, pick up the grenade launcher, and then run all the way back and continue the game. And on one hand, you know, I get it. We have 2 playable characters, who each have 6 slots, so that's 12 in total, but insultingly, unlike the RE1 remake, shotguns and other large weapons take up 2 slots. So realistically, you wouldn't be able to have a pistol, a shotgun, a herb, or maybe a spray, and some spare ammo too, because you just won't have the room for it. And there are quite a few enemies in this game that like to eat all of your bullets without flinching. Ultimately, this all just makes this game a pain in the ass to play. And before any of you fuckers start typing away and tell me that this is more realistic and makes sense and is therefore better because of that, fuck you. This is a game where gigantic reptilian zombies attack you out of nowhere, for fuck's sake. Adding to this whole inventory problem even more is how this game handles mixing herbs. Rebecca is the only one that can combine herbs in this game. She's the only one that can just mash this shit together to a pulp to create a pile of desiccated plant. Because Billy is the army man and is so cool, because of that, he gets a shitty lighter, which I think is useful for like 2 puzzles max. So if you're Billy and you see some herbs, you best keep on walking, because this shit is gonna fill up your slots real quick and be a massive pain in the ass. Anyway, after going through the training facility and the basement area, you wind up in an old laboratory where early experimentation on the progenitor virus was being performed. And I know I haven't even mentioned any of that kind of stuff yet, but we'll get into it soon, don't worry. This area is actually kind of interesting because for a large portion of it, Rebecca and Billy are actually split up from each other, with one character being stuck up on the upper level and the other on the lower level. But using a service elevator located in 2 of the rooms, you can pass small items to each other. So as the character on the upper level, you have to explore around and find a key to pass down to the other so they can progress further. And to me, this is when the 2 character system works at its best, when the characters are actually split up and are both useful to perform individual tasks. And yeah, throughout the rest of the game, there may be a big box that Billy has to move or a chemical that Rebecca has to mix together or whatever, but these little moments aren't really great at selling this system to me. I think it works way better when we, the player, have to deal with the characters being split up and unable to share inventory or defend each other. So yeah, this might actually be my favorite part of the game, just for the fact that it lets both characters be equally useful for a bit. But this is also a good time to bring up what I think may be the worst enemy in the history of Resident Evil. Or at least the older REs anyway.
Damn it! Get the fuck off, asshole!
The humanoid leeches are by far the most annoying thing to fight in this entire game. They take a ridiculous amount of ammo to kill, are always placed in the most annoying places possible, and they have this massive ranged attack that almost always slapped my ass as I was running away from them. I hate them with a passion, and they look so stupid, so they aren't even scary. Fuck the humanoid leeches. I bring this up here because it was around this point in the game when I realized how much I actually hated these fucking things. But the laboratory doesn't really last that long, and shortly we get sent off to the factory area, and this is where I started to not like this game very much. It starts off pretty interestingly though. At the end of the laboratory section, Billy and Rebecca get split up because, well, this happens. So Rebecca has to go alone for a bit and find a way to get down to the lower levels. And then, because the game forgot that it was a tie-in to RE1 for a second there, here's Enrico from out of nowhere, and he's gone again. And because this game really wants you to know that this is a prequel to RE1, here is a tyrant to fight. Look, I'll be honest, I was shitting myself when I saw the tyrant, both out of excitement and stress. I feel like we don't really see the original Tyrant often enough in the series, so I'm very glad that it got some representation here, but fuck. They decided to make you fight this thing in a tiny little room, and because its moveset is, I think, almost the exact same as the Tyrant from the end of RE1, this fight can get old real quick, because, I don't know if you remember, that fight took place on a giant helipad, but it gets worse, because you have to fight this thing again later on, in an area that's somehow worse than this one. Anyway, some other stuff happens and you eventually run into Billy again. So the team's back together and just in time for one of the best puzzles in the game. Unironically, I genuinely mean this. Moving boxes to form a bridge so that we can reach this handle on the other side. Honestly, I had way too much fun with this puzzle, but in hindsight, it was probably because of how much of a break it was from the rest of the game. This monotonous puzzle, where you move crates, genuinely excited me. It was at this point in time that I just felt like I wanted the game to be over. This part of the game especially feels boring, mainly because there's nothing really going on. The story at this point is all about escaping from this place, but at this point, I'm not even sure where I am anymore. And I know, we'll get to him in a second. Oh wait, we can actually get to him now. So the big evil monster bad guy in this game is Dr. Marcus. This man right here. I'm not going super into detail here because honestly, it's all a bit stupid and I don't really care. But basically, this guy was kind of the teacher of Wesker and Birkin when they were kind of his prized pupils, I guess. But these two also betrayed and killed him in order to take his research on the progenitor virus, which was the precursor to the T-virus. So this guy is essentially the reason for why we have Resident Evil in the first place, basically. But when those two killed Marcus, they also disposed of something called the Queen Leech. And the leech started to, eat his corpse, which gave it his memories. So this thing is both this guy and simultaneously a disgusting leech monster. Again, did we really need a prequel to Resident Evil 1? Did we really need it? Like, seriously. So it might just be me. And for some context here, I am very, very okay with dumb, stupid shit in stories. Metal Gear and Kingdom Hearts are two of my favorite franchises ever, and there's tons of stupid shit in both of those series. But I hate this kind of stupid, especially when it's done badly. Marcus/Queen Leech is barely a presence in this game, except for a handful of cutscenes, but even then, it's easy to just completely forget about it. And yeah, Wesker in RE1 barely has any screen time either, but Wesker's cool. Part of what makes him such a good villain in that game is how little screen time he gets, because it builds up this mystery about him, and then he betrays you at the end. And sure, you might have seen it coming, it's extremely obvious, but it still added a nice bit of dramatic tension to the climax of the game. This Queen Leech motherfucker just waltzes in every now and then, expects you to give a shit about its villain monologues and weird lines, and then fucks off again. And this first boss fight with it isn't really that great either. You just kind of stay at one end of the room and blast it a bunch, which I get is most RE bosses. But there's no cool gimmick or mechanic here. You can't use the partner system in any interesting ways, you just run in circles until this thing is dead. But anyway, we're approaching the climax of the game now, and it's safe to say that the final boss in this game is one of the worst out of all of the games I've played in the series so far. It's the Queen Leech again, but as this giant meat blob that you just have to shoot over and over again. Remember, if you've decided to come this far into the game without the grenade launcher, or the shotgun, or some extra heals you had to leave behind, this is the point where you need to backtrack to get that stuff. And if anyone watching actually did that, I'm so sorry. Luckily, the room before the final boss gives you just enough to scrape by. But, oh my god, I just hated this boss with every fiber of my being. The first phase is where you just shoot. But the second phase is where things really start to get shit. They realize that this thing hates the sunlight for whatever fucking reason. And luckily, they're in an area with a big roof that can open up if these 4 valves are turned. But instead of just being able to figure this out and do it straight away when you fight the boss, as opposed to going through that entire first phase, you have to do the first phase before being able to turn any of the valves. And then in the second phase, you're forced to control only Billy, as Rebecca and her AI goes to turn off each of the valves. Never mind that it would be quicker if they both did it at the same time, and this would have been a great way to show off the character switching system one final time, by being able to switch to each character as they're turning the valves or something to optimize the entire fight and use character switching in a cool, efficient way. No. Instead, as Billy, you have to protect Rebecca from the boss, even though she will just run straight into the fucking thing as she travels to the next valve, getting damaged in the process. Plus, when she gets to each valve, the boss aggroes onto her again, almost guaranteeing she'll take more damage. I got more game overs here due to this than in the entirety of my first playthrough of Dark Souls, but at least in that game, it was completely down to how shit I was. In this fight, it just feels like you're fighting against bad design and baffling AI, and if you don't have much ammo at this point, I'm sorry to say that you may be fucked. I hated this fight with a passion, and it unfortunately left a pretty bad taste in my mouth after beating the game. The thing with Resident Evil 0 is that it has a lot of great ideas on paper. Being able to control 2 different characters that each have their own unique skill set that makes them useful for solving their own puzzles is a neat idea, and in a few ways, it definitely succeeds with that. But as a game by its own merits, I don't think it really executes its ideas all that successfully. And as a prequel to RE1, it could have gone even further in depth with how Umbrella became what it is, but unfortunately, it fails in making any of it interesting. There is good stuff here, and there are things that I genuinely enjoyed, but I'm walking away from this experience with an incredibly mixed reaction. Resident Evil Zero is a game that is perpetually going to be a C tier on people's lists, and if you love the game, more power to you. Again, there are little nuggets of greatness in this game, but with the way it is, I just have way too many problems with it to ever justify replaying it for my own satisfaction. I would be happy to never play this game again. It started off feeling like a fresh take on a bloated genre, and ended up feeling like a bloated experience held back by poor design and an underwhelming story.
That's enough!